All right.
you don't want to like jump the gun
No,
because
no, no.
someone might tune in right at that
Oh,
particular
yeah,
moment.
yeah.
And so we'll wait a minute.
All right, sounds
Get
good.
you comfortable. You got your water.
Yep.
You got your composure.
Ha, well, now that's another story.
Uh-huh. They can hear you.
Oh, okay, well, true confessions.
Yeah. Tell them you're just about to start.
Okay.
7:30 coming up here
Soon that time arrives. Hmm.
All right. Well, this is the longest minute on record.
Well, maybe time has, there have been so many portals that have been set to naught, one way or the other.
All right. So it's 7:30.
All right,
Are you ready?
sure.
Take it away.
All right. Well, greetings, everybody, and here we are again in the evening of spring on the west coast of our continent. And, well, it's going to be like this, I think. Rather than some great, sculpted, encyclopedic whole relationship, it's going to be more like a certain kind of reverie. But the reverie, though tissue thin in the way that it first establishes itself, um, will conduct itself through realm after realm of transposed associations in such a way as to give us a taste of the flavors of some of this that we're considering. We're considering actually the person or persona. It's not sure. Maybe this talk will establish whether it's one or the other. The person or persona of the poet as an archetypal just element to which we, you and I, relate as, in our heart of hearts, as no one. But in ourselves as questing individuals seeking education, then, well, we reach into the masterpieces of literature to try to consider the eternal masters of the art of the book. We can put it that way. And among the masters of the art of the book, we have to, this evening, present forthrightly the enigmatic person or persona of Henry Miller. Henry Miller, whom I will consider in a certain way as a very kind of unique manifestation of the archetype of the poet, as well as a unique manifestation of many, many, many other kind of personas and like actorly selves and representations of different practices of the literary art, because he's those things. But always, though, the idea will be to draw from that a sense of our natural being as our natural being as as sages, which is to be everyone and no one at the same time. Well, that's highfalutin talk, but Henry Miller could get that way. So the thing about Miller is this, just to start off as a stylist, he uniquely has a kind of like a in his physical being, you can somehow pick up from the sentences that he writes upon the page. You pick up an image of his physical being, like a this is how we appreciate the arts of calligraphy, because we can look at the writing and we can see the writing appeals to us, thematically and socially, because he's an acknowledged master. So we reach into it looking for something like that. But there's also a sense of something else that is speaking to us, an energy which at first might seem to be beyond words, but it's actually not so much beyond words as within words. The energy within words. And at that point, then the only way to reach more into what's in our tradition to enable us to talk about it, we have to reach into the areas of religion and notions of the logos and notions of the expansive meaning within the word and notions of the dimensionless and non-conceptual realities, which underlie all of our alphabets. And so in the writerly arts, this is something that Henry Miller, if he had not written, I would not even be talking of him in this way. You see, it's like an inspiring form of writing that inspires one to try to understand what it is about it that it is so moving. And so we've spoken of the energy within the word, and that's led us into the meanings and the dynamic meanings within the word, which already begins to point to realities that, though are ultimate, are also, to our mode of being here on this earth, dimensionless. But Miller points the way to that kind of thing, as calligraphy does, which it doesn't represent anything really. It might, the slashes and splashes and swatches of ink upon the page might remind you of a house or an apple tree or a mountain or a hill, and they do, but the idea that is being represented is so much more exact to what is being conveyed than what your eye tells you. So, that being said, the thing about Miller also is, with this kind of weird and deep and active insight into the meaning of the original word, this also gives him a certain inspiration as an interpreter of other works of literature. Enthusiasm. We'll bring that word in. Enthusiasm. In theos, which means to be filled with the God. Enthusiasm. And it is the enthusiasm, which is his natural gift, which travels through his reading eye. One of the things that makes him such a colossal presence in literature is his insight into other writers, which simultaneously is great insight into those other writers, but also throws light upon what he himself is trying to say out of himself, because he's always trying to give out of himself. So let's go deeply into a person, an individual, a persona that he looks at and who appeals to him. Something that would appeal. Oh, and even now, before I say the words of this particular poet, my eyes fall upon Ezra Pound, as quoted by Ferlinghetti on the wall over there. And there's a meaning behind it, because I have to bring in Ezra Pound a little bit too, and I hadn't expected to be inspired to do that, and we'll see if it's really possible. But first, I want to talk about Henry Miller on Arthur Rimbaud. Now, one thing about Henry Miller in comparison to Ezra Pound, and even, dare I say it, also Arthur Rimbaud, Henry Miller is funny, and his sense of humor is what allows him to simultaneously, and he's the only writer I've known to do it so clearly, to satirize Ezra Pound in some of his writings. But for Arthur Rimbaud, he does something different, because Arthur Rimbaud is a different kind of figure to him. Henry Miller is a different kind of Prometheus. Arthur Rimbaud is an archetypal Prometheus, right, for all of us. In so many ways, the myth of Rambo and the poetry of Rimbaud, which is somehow everybody has their own version of the relationship between those two things. But for Henry Miller, it is born in him. This idea, this understanding of Rimbaud is simultaneous with his understanding of himself as a different type of Prometheus. Because indeed, Henry Miller is a different type of Prometheus in his mythic poetic reality than is Rimbaud, who is such a classic Prometheus to all of us. But from Henry Miller's perspective, as a different kind of Prometheus, one Prometheus looking at another Prometheus, right? This is the person and the persona, or the persona and the person. It's like it even goes into our ideas of what constitutes Prometheusness, and isn't that problematic? But yet that's what we have to tackle. Well, so he writes a beautiful book about Rumbo, and it was published right at I believe it was his first book that he published at the end of the Second World War. After the end of the Second World War, not to point to that as the big, as the only external signifier of the meaning of the literary work in time. But Well, before the post-war consensus became so solidly the constellation that has ruled the body politic for all these years that we see breaking apart now, in so many distressing ways. But even before that becomes oh so solidified, not only for the world, but for America's notion of itself, for, each generation's notion of itself, Henry Miller makes a book about this Prometheus, this fellow Prometheus, Arthur Rimbaud. Now, to go into the myth of Arthur Rimbaud is, there is an eternity enough for that. And that eternity in which we can understand the myth of Rambo is present to us in the ever-living transcendent energy of the meaning of the word. That's there. But for Henry Miller, it's he's going to look at him like a figure to contemplate in really kind of his own spiritual drama. So Arthur Rimbaud was, first of all, you can say everything about Arthur Rimbaud, and you can also say the exact opposite, and there are beautiful reasons for everything that you will ever say. But what I'm going to say now, highly simplified, is what we need to understand about Arthur Rimbaud in the whole of his arc, not just the fiery baptism that we know so well, which resulted in his symbolist poetry. But we also have to look at Rambo as formative of one. First of all, somehow, how did it happen? A French peasant. Well, it was they owned land, so it was a different kind of like. And I cannot descry, the European class structure at that time, in France, much less. But his father was a military officer. I'm talking about Rimbaud now. And was at home just a little bit before he departed altogether. And a career military, did I say officer? I'm not sure. I don't think he was an officer exactly. But if he was, it was a battlefield kind of promotion, because he was, I guess you could say, he was of the warrior at that time, a military. That was his work, and that was what he was. That was Rimbaud's father. And also, okay, so the school system, did I mention that? How could it be, though, the elementary education, there must have been something good, Was there something in the water, or is it a fact that, no, it doesn't, it's not a prodigy, it's not a phenomena that there's inspired education in early childhood. But there was something that Rimbaud, maybe this is part of his Promethean spark, it came to Rimbaud in childhood, this kind of like, this prodigal touch. And it extended itself with the propulsive power of his imagination into works that he did just as a kid in grade school, or their version of it, in 19th century France. Translations from Latin and tremendous fugues and heroic adventures, and a mind a stew in the scriptures and the Arabian Nights and all of the childhood adventure stories that were available at that time, and also, a naturalist's eye of the landscape, and also close by the realities of country life. And this was all somehow transmuted at such an early age. These astounding works made by Rimbaud, and they still are around. You can read them, and perhaps they don't match the way I'm describing them now, but when you think about, this is Rimbaud writing when he was 10. Here he is talking about, ambuscades and escapades of Roman emperors, and here he's like scratching his nose or looking at the ground, and you see all of this stuff, and it's just part of the fascination of Rimbaud that you can create all this stuff about him. But anyway, so from that age, it seemed to begin a mythic kind of sense, a mythic understanding of literature. And then I have to mention, childhood learning. Then I have to mention cataclysm, the cataclysm of war. What was that? The Franco-German War? I don't remember what it's called, in the 1870s. The beginning and the end of the Paris Commune. And a whole lot of idealism there, as only the French can be idealistic. And that, too, is something that is worthy to pursue for an eternity. But that being said, things were made of wood, foundations were of sand, the flowing of the river shifted, and chaos ensued. And it was in this context of this war that was the beginning of Rambo's early initiation into adulthood, or what would you call it, or supercharged meta-adolescence. It was like he made his way on foot as a runaway to get away. I got it marked. I can put this down. As a runaway to get away from home through the Ardennes, through these blasted forests, where, and he wrote about it too. Rimbaud, the surrealist, is there, and we acknowledge it, but we also have to look at Rimbaud, the Stephen Crane style, red badge of courage kind of poet, because you can find those in his poems, images of what he saw with his physical eye, both in the countryside, skirting the edges of battlefields to make his way to Paris, where he was arrested. See, so you got war, and then when I say arrested in Paris, and like I say, Rimbaud's biography is as vast as they come, and so whatever that I say here, I say with a certain kind of license, because there will be someone who corroborates this somewhere. But no, he was arrested when he arrived in Paris, and it is said something bad happened while he was in prison, And we have to consider that, something bad happened, like in a victimization sense. And so, not to be psychological, but we have to look at the subsequent life of Rambo, especially in France, and the things that he did and what he engaged in. And, stuff that he wrote when he was 18, the ways that it was his fate to act it out in real life. And so that could be one other thing that makes him utterly uniquely Promethean, is that what he conceived of in his vastest and most grandiose self, before he had real experience of the world, take that with a grain of salt, because, the experience of the world begins before you are born. And so it's not like we achieve some greater selfhood as we pile on the years of our life arc. It's not like that. And it is the poets who see this. And even for Miller, Henry Miller, seeing Rimbaud this way is a way for him to see back behind Rimbaud into this creative fecundity, into this darkness, out of which come these charged archetypes which make these compelling masks of personhood or persona. Anyway, so then Rimbaud, and then it's all kind of like, I would think, fascinatingly enough, and perhaps worth it to consider, a recapitulation of his childhood life, where this early prodigy discovering in a whirl of wood grain in a church pew a vast universe of truth and agony and desire, and then looking outside and seeing a cow kick over a pail of milk and the milk spilling out upon the ground, like rivers of pearl. I mean, where does surrealism end and where does the natural eye begin? Well, Rimbaud brings the question to us in this way, like all good surrealists do. All good surrealists are actually commonplace realists. That's hyperbolic in the tradition of Henry Miller, And if it's funny, then good. And if it's true, then and if it's false, then forgive me, it's like that. But anyway, so Rambo experienced all of this idealistic madness and derangement, and this perverse yet unique understanding or intuition that came to him out of the womb, which he brought into the world when it wasn't there before, of this notion of the seer. And the seer arrives at an understanding of the self through the exhaustion of all the poisons of experience, through going through the alchemy of every malady, of every agony, of every sin, of every folly, of every foolishness, of every trial. Oh, and it sounds wonderful and it makes for great storytelling, but it's utterly hyperbolic, because we know that if you really believe that, You just don't have a sense of humor. And that's where Henry Miller knows. And Henry Miller shouts across the void of the ages to Rambo, "Hey, fellow Prometheus, where do you hear the laughter coming from?" You know, and Rambo on the other side just says, some like, very colorful stream of obscenities. Or perhaps, some kind of like self-obsessed rant. Or perhaps walks and journeys across miles of unknown terrain, which he did also after he renounced poetry, which let's just jump ahead to that part of the Rambo mythos. At the age of 18, it is said, after retreating more than once back home to Charleville, away from the Paris Bohemia where he was like acting out all kinds of travail and grief and agony, but for some reason it was a mythical thing to do at that time, and there were people around who aided and abetted it. It's not so you can actually, deconstruct it kind of in that way, but at the same time, it's what allowed his work to be preserved and to be kept and maintained so that it would become made known, which is another story in and of itself, how we come to read the actual poetry of Rimbaud. Anyway, so after retreating back to Charleville, and in writing in a barn, these beautiful poems, which when I first came upon them, not necessarily true confessions, but true, the most exciting thing about Rimbaud, even before the myth of it all, began to create one's, like a cocoon, one creates a world around it, for one's own subsequent, vocation. But for me, it was like this notion, whoa, these were the first prose poems I ever saw. And they were called prose poems. It was like, oh, these are prose poems. It was like, for me, it was like, oh, so, free verse, you got to do ba 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 ba. But with a prose poem, you can just disappear into the page, and disappear into the sentences. And so, boy, but I didn't understand it the way that I do now. But the beginning of it was back then. And these are demonic seed ideas that are part of what naturally flower from us, as we study literature in the old way. And the only thing that can teach you to study literature in the old way is literature teaching you in the old way. So, but anyway, so this becomes his myth. But then, and this is even of greater interest sometimes, it has yet to be fully researched, and it's every bit as legendary. Rambo split, as they say. Rambo with the wind at his heels, and that is his poetic image. Rambo renounced poetry with this such memorable, in such a memorable way that it becomes part of his myth. And so for the rest of his life, a great portion of his life, of the rest of his life, is spent as what you could call a soldier of fortune in the distant lands, in Ethiopia, in Yemen, in the Sudan, in places that were not known to nationhood, even in that region at that time, exploring places that no one had ever gone before, at least who saw it from those eyes. And even though his letters home, he continues to write. Isn't that interesting? So really, did he renounce poetry at all? No, because his letters are our primary source of what he did. And what are his letters like? Well, they're not like effusive descriptions. They're not certainly, surrealist prose poems, but it's a different character almost. It's a different persona. It's a different mask, and yet at the same time, you can feel a similar singularity of purpose, a similar intensity, and a similar, defiance, and a similar almost, but it doesn't quite make it to where it's said out loud, in any sense, a similar idealism, but maybe you would say single-mindedness. Single-mindedness. If thine eye be single, then thy eye will be full of light. So Miller's message to us is that when you read the words, if you reach deeply into the energy of the words will illuminate the myth of the maker. And that's the only way you're going to find the perspective to keep the work from possessing you. And Miller allowed himself to be possessed again and again, and this is how he learned, and this is what makes him such a colossal literary critic. But anyway, so let's talk about his prose, though, as a style. One more thing I want to say about his style and his prose, though, And that is, there is a kind of a saint. Here's what's saintly. We haven't used that word yet. In Miller, and you could almost say in Rambo also, saintly, woke single-mindedness. A saint is so subsumed or consumed by the ideal of their soul that there's a certain uniqueness, in their character. But of course, in the case of Rambo, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily good, or do-gooders. But though morality is a part of it, But that's a whole other question. But and I don't even remember what I was gonna say about it. A saint, Oh yeah, Rimbaud. No, Henry Miller as a saint, being able to see. Ah, yes, now I get it. It's like the sage, the archetype of the poet, and the sage behind that. It's like the age-old genre, Literature allows us to speak of things as genres, though they may not even be that. Literature allows us to make up ideas about what we might really mean. And so that's poetic license for you. And, hopefully you will allow me that, But at any rate, so it's the figure of the sage. And who is the sage? The sage is no one. The sage is you. The sage is me. The sage is no one, and always has been. Henry Miller confesses it straight out, again and again and again, that at a certain point he realized all he wanted to do was to write. And so whatever, after hells and agonies and fiery baptisms, he wrote, and but then something else happened, which was a different kind of hassle. Then he became famous, and then he became known, and by virtue of which, that's how we know about these books. But for Henry Miller and for us, understanding it, in a deep sense of the real energy of the word, it is like, no, this is writing. This is writing. Oh, this other stuff, this fame thing. Oh, Henry Miller says, let's imagine him saying it. Ah, what a hassle. Well, okay. Oh, okay. I can get enough money to live on. Okay. Oh God, I have to deal with all this publicity. But what's worse, oh my God, I have to do what was so magical to others before. I got to do this again. This was that's where it takes. It takes supreme egotism, the self-absorption of the saint. It takes that, but what is given is what is needed. See, this is the difference in morality. We take what we need, what we believe we need, and in the world of appearances, it seems to be so. But we are given what we need. We are given what we need by these things that we're not even noticing at the time. And for some reason, Henry Miller, sometimes he would call it my split personality. He was able to see that both of these things were true. And so this enabled him to surrender to this fame thing and to this is what happened inwardly. You just know it. It's like, okay, I know I am no one. My happiness has come from that. That's been the end of my pain. I can joyfully be no one, and that gives me eyes to see. Oh, but now I have 50 letters to answer. Oh, but now I have to type these contracts. Oh, but now I have to worry about whether they're cheating me. Oh, but now there's a person knocking at my door and I don't know who they are, but they say they know me, and how am I going to think, And so this was like, whoa, so when Henry Miller, let me just make a long story short. He surrenders to this and he realized, okay, this is how no one is made known. And I am no one. This is my being as the Creator. I can understand this from my own side. And then this other side of things, this external side of things, seems to be satisfied through the medium of this. It's not an art form. It was at one time. It was a book. It was a book that I wrote, but then it became this product of a certain style of a medium of exchange in the 20th century, and I do not know if it matters anymore or not, but I surrender to this because I know I'm imagining how Henry Miller kind of arrived at this, because I know that there are those out there for whom my words are an inspiration, as I have been inspired by the words that I have read and by the myths that I have extrapolated from what I have read. So I know that that is out there too. But at the same time, I'm a funny fellow, and I understand that it doesn't matter because I could inspire them, but anything is going to inspire them. And if it doesn't happen in this lifetime, it will happen in the next or the next or the next or the next or the next. So really, there's all the time in the world, and I really have nothing to do with it, except I've got this little secret understanding of the energies of the word. And somehow, by working with it with the right spirit of humility, I can step into a different sense of time, which is what my soul really desires, what my soul really needs. And the only place where need and desire become one thing are in the needs of the soul in relation to the realm of the timeless. And so Miller can speak of this, with a certain kind of like humor because he's got a detached self about it. It was something that he surrendered to and then he realized it. But his agony was before the realization of that. And his heroism was that he continued to persist in trying to reach a certain kind of discipline which would make him worthy of the visitation of the gift when it would come, which he had a previous kind of like inkling of, which was part of his life course. But, and so finally, stylistically then, about Miller as a prose stylist, it's very much, for me at least, it's a mirror of my own density, I mean, for Miller, looking at Rambo, it's like a fellow Prometheus looking at a Prometheus across a gap of a century or so and an epoch. But for me and Miller, it's like a golden density looking at a golden density, and both of them would rather deal with their own density, but they still feel compelled to kind of interrelate so that there can be an understanding that they will somehow achieve. They're led by their interests, even though their interests are also aversions, but they have this ability or this idealism which allows them to step over their aversions in order to reach a deeper understanding of the energy that is, compelling the pen to touch the page in these lines. Anyway, but let's hear some of these lines. Okay, and then, but also I mentioned the saint. Let me also mention the rebel, the Promethean thing, right? Prometheus is the archetypal rebel, and Prometheus is the archetypal heroic saint. And Rambo touches on this in a certain sense, but he's also a hero of renunciation. And he's also, he's just so many things. Boy, one of these days we're going to realize that, a paragraph of A Season in Hell or Illuminations, it actually is better than his myth. That will be a great day when we realize that the poetry of Rambo is actually, not forget the myth, but, let's look at this, because this was actually the transfigured sense of time. After that, Rambo, it's not like he surrenders to time, but it's more like he's butting heads with it. And we still love him because he is himself. But the animal nature kind of is like taken over in the same way that, like a buffalo will kind of just do the same thing again and again and succeed in wearing something away. But at the same time, it's an animal and it's a repetitive thing. And for Rimbaud, man, he could have, maybe if he had become a painter, then he could have dealt with these goopy textures and these resistant mediums, and he could have really just done a lot of like repetition to establish these patterns. But it was because, I believe, of just the influences of his upbringing and the society at that time, and also the war and all of this stuff. It became like everybody had to have the ultimate surrender to the need to survive. And for Rambo, his idea was he would go to the colonies and strike it rich. And so this guides him at the same time. He doesn't necessarily strike it rich. He carries enough gold to weigh him down going through the hot jungle heat, But because that's his only security, good God, But that's we speak of it now because he did that, and so bless his heart, But at the same time, so let's hear what Miller has to say in Miller's words. The rebel and the saint. For Miller, it's important that he puts it this way. Well, I'll get to that. Let's just read a little bit of Miller, just because, after all, he's a writer. We might as well read it. Okay, speaking of Rambo, all the rebelliousness which I share with them derives from this problem, which, as nearly as I can express it, means the search for one's true link with humanity. One finds it neither in the personal life nor in the collective life, if one is of this type. So right now we can say, oh, this is Miller talking about the Promethean type. And right now it is. But it's also Miller talking about the Hamlet type. And it's also Miller as a reader of what was contemporary psychology at that time. And type means everything else there. And so as I read Miller a lot of times, I am kind of like dizzied by the conglomerative kind of like jazz associations of the commonplace words that he's using, because I know the times in which he writes are so formative to our understanding of like contemporary literature. And yet he makes fun of so much of it in such a really subtle way. But anyway, so let's go on with Miller, though. You know, he identifies with Rimbaud in this way. Miller writes, one is unadaptable to the point of madness. One longs to find his peer, but one is surrounded by vast empty spaces. One needs a teacher, but one lacks the humility, the flexibility, the patience which is demanded. One is not even at home or at ease with the great in spirit. Even the highest are defective or suspect, and yet one has affinities only with these highest types. It is a dilemma of the first magnitude, a dilemma fraught with the highest significance. One has to establish the ultimate difference of his own peculiar being, and doing so discover his kinship with all humanity, even the very lowest. Acceptance is the key word, but acceptance is precisely the great stumbling block. It has to be total acceptance and not conformity. So, you know, so much is there, but also he's speaking of Rambo in this way, and he's presenting a dilemma for Rambo, which Rambo resolved in the same way that, you know, the animal will resolves itself, even though it goes on being beautiful, just for that reason. He's also, but Miller is talking about, the terms of a certain kind of drama which trap one, and yet that is part of one's greatness or part of one's memorability, to be trapped in this dilemma, and they become such human figures that you identify with, because you know you are no one, and you know you are everyone, and you know, like them, you are trapped in that same dilemma, and you feel with them in the eternity of the literary moment of insight. And this is the source of Miller's insight into Rimbaud's dilemma. And yet, Miller goes, and, you know, I love him because he's such a great minister. He says this about it. I'll say this. He says, I'm going to quote Miller again, and this is Miller's kind of transfiguration of Rimbaud's dilemma. And I will say this as a literary work, as a prose poem, which you could call it that way. It's a prose poem insofar as each paragraph is going to give you a different turn of the ways that your mind provides you to interpret it. Each paragraph would repeat what I'm saying and reflect it in a certain way. You know, I think that could be a true statement. But anyway, but here's Miller's transfiguration of Rimbaud's dilemma, if I can reach and see. He writes, the important thing about death for humans, I'll say it. The language is, you know, it's 1950s language. So the important thing about death for man, meaning the universal human figure, the important thing about death for man is that he is able to distinguish it from dissolution. Man dies for something if he dies at all. The order and harmony which spring from primordial chaos, as the myths tell us, infuse our lives with a purpose which is beyond us, a purpose to which we sacrifice ourselves when we achieve awareness. The order and harmony which spring from primordial chaos. This is the mythic view of the world speaking, as only the poet can explicate it. You know, this full understanding given all at once as a thing, as given by the energy of the word before you even speak it, is that chaos gives, but not willingly, and yet it does give. And harmony and order spring from primordial chaos. And the immediacy of that, if such an understanding reaches you before you have words for it, how blessed you are. And yet somehow I believe that's the actual heritage of the human being in their destiny as no one, which Henry Miller realized for us and became famous so that he could teach us about it and so that we can learn about it right now. Anyway, but here's how he transfigures Rimbaud's dilemma. The important thing about death for man is that he is able to distinguish it from dissolution. Man dies for something if he dies at all. The order and harmony which sprang from primordial chaos, as the myths tell us, infuse our lives with a purpose which is beyond us, a purpose to which we sacrifice ourselves when we achieve awareness. When we achieve awareness, we sacrifice this notion of ourselves. Perhaps we become no one, or at least we've sacrificed our idea of ourselves as someone. But then, like all sacrifices, it is not complete by its very nature. It is simply necessary. But there is more to the sacrifice that makes it valid, and that is the purpose. And so, he writes, this sacrifice is made on the altar of creation. What we create with hand and tongue is nothing. It is what we create with our lives that counts. It is only when we make ourselves a part of creation that we begin to live. It is not death which challenges us at every step, but life. We have honored the Death Eaters ad nauseum. But what of those who accept the challenge of life? In what way do we honor these? From Lucifer to Antichrist, there runs a flame of passion which man will always honor as long as he is mere man. It is against his passion, which is the flame of life, that we must oppose the serene acceptance of the enlightened ones. Let me read that in a way that has more meaning. It is against this passion, which is the flame of life, that we must oppose the serene acceptance of the enlightened ones. It is against this passion, which is the flame of life, that we must oppose the enlightenment, the serene acceptance of the enlightened ones. This is very key. And Rambo is the flame, but Henry Miller is bringing the light of the flame. And this is a complete thing, because we must realize it is the nature of fire to consume. And the earthly creative fire, and it is earthly, and it is creative, and it is real. The earthly creative fire burns for real in that it possesses one to the degree that one can achieve such great works with the same mentality that will lead one to utterly misvalue it and utterly throw it away, and even to conduct one's life in denial of it, in oblivion of it, and think that it is in defiance. Because one is used to these outmoded models of heroism, perhaps, or the things that, like Krishnamurti put it really, really clearly when he just said, any talent for which one is honored for, will make one become dull and arrogant and heavy if one identifies oneself with the praise that one gets, And Krishnamurti, whom Henry Miller wrote about, like Henry Miller, Krishnamurti is a certain kind of gifted California poet and writer and sage. And Henry Miller wrote some really perceptive things about Krishnamurti, or appreciative things, which we may or may not have time to go into. But Krishnamurti also is one to go to understand the true freedom of the not self, even though one puts, by virtue of one's gift, all that is of the self as part of its expressive capacity, And that's what any poet or any writer does. That's what all of us do. And Henry Miller is just a model for us and an example. It's like a show, but it's a good show. Poetry is illusion, as Lama Govinda said. As Lama Govinda said when Stephen Mitchell said, "Is poetry illusion?" Lama Govinda said, "Long live illusion." Of course, you know. But anyway, let's just put that over to the side for just a moment, because there has to be some other idea that's just waiting for me out there. Let's look at, okay, the transfiguring nature of the creative act. Okay, let's step back from that. This is a social message that Henry Miller's writing has. He's also, in a certain sense, a statesman. Well, that's a certain way of putting it. When Shelley says poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, what a juicy bit of hyperbole. And oh, what meanings that it has, and oh, how it would lead one astray if one took it in any way literally, not literarily. But well, with Miller, it's the same kind of thing when he asks us, you know, when he sees this also in Rambo, you know, this social dilemma of the creative personality, because they're the energies of the word within them. These energies that seem so dimensionless, these energies that they are the only ones to be a witness of, have no kind of like corresponding vibration in the external world. And yet, everything that the external world gives as a way to express it, which is language, is just given so overwhelmingly that, you know, one just doesn't know which eyes to look through, you know, such a dizzying experience. And yet that's poetry. That's a universal experience. We think that it's so unique because that's the way we have decided to become used to ourselves. And so there are glimmers of this familiarity, this dance between familiarity and unfamiliarity offered in the aesthetic experience, right? Okay, so I'm sure there's a million other things, and I haven't looked at my watch, but I'm going to read a poem now. Existential knowing is values conceived. And what I want to dedicate this poem to is Henry Miller's appreciation of the 19th century as a theater of misfits. I mean, he saw the same, and he could have delineated it, and he did, and he wrote a beautiful book even earlier about D.H. Lawrence, a highly personal book. But you could tell that's how the Rambo book is so great, because the D.H. Lawrence book was kind of like how he tried out his way, you know, of identifying with these figures and then seeing, you know, kind of their inner dilemma, you know, in the mask of themselves. So Henry Miller's gallery of 19th century misfits: Strindberg, Nerval, Rambo, Kierkegaard, you know, it goes on, Marx. These who, as he called it, the 19th century was the most God-haunted of all the centuries, because I guess for him and Henry Miller, you know, he arrives, you know, with his connection to humanity, he arrives at this enlightened figure of the archetype of the mother. He saw in Rambo's mother the reflection of his mother, you know, hard, mercantile, and practical, and so utterly kind of like antithetical somehow. You know, the resistant medium of character formation, you know, and the endless hypnoses that ensue from that. But he could see that, you know, in Freud, for example, you know, in all of them, this, you know, and I dig that. I like that a whole lot, because there's a certain purity in those thinkers that Miller appreciates and carries forward in a way that so many who have rejected them as archaic are oblivious to. And so this is why another way in which Miller is colossal is a literary critic, you know. And, you know, even though it's such a frightening word, a literary critic, what one does as a literary critic is clarify notions of beauty, you know, and balance them with notions of harmony and truth. And the same tools available to the poet are available to the critic, because they're the same. You know, it's like, you know, behind them is no one. No one, only no one can be all of these different kind of like genre creators. Anyway, so this is an excuse for me to put the word existential into a title of a poem. Existential knowing is value conceived, flowing from cause to source and back and forth, cups poured into one another by skillful jugglery, not asterisked away from the Caucasus, in locks and levies from the source of us. Though I am more like Gideon, I am enamored with the winged feet. At least I'm more like Kierkegaard, in a high wind, on a hilltop, guarding sheep, than I am like Ovid, exiled in Odessa. Though I'll wear any of these persons as a portrait on a transparent sweatshirt, even at the expense of good taste, in the time zones of Abraham Lincoln. Letters to mother scrawled in the sand. So let's just mention, so I've mentioned mothers a little bit. That too can be part of his thing. We're going to have to look at Rambo a little bit. But there is another thing lurking hereabouts. Yes, it is. We have to bring in Ezra Pound a little bit too now. Though I've hardly read the essay that I did mention, Money and How It Got That Way, let's just begin when we think about Henry Miller, because I have made the vulgar assertion that Henry Miller satirized Ezra Pound in a way that how could anyone do this, and but so skillfully and so insightfully. So we have to go into that a little bit. Okay, and we're good with time. So, I have slept upon on the steps of Roquefixade and looked out upon the landscape. I am paraphrasing some lines of Ezra Pound, in Ezra Pound's youth when he went on a walking tour through southern France. And he visited some of the sites of the old troubadour castles, some of the Cathar castles, and he discovered in Toulouse these ancient manuscripts and musical manuscripts, and he found the musical notations of old troubadour songs sung by the troubadours of southern France and Provence. This hidden kind of underground passage between the French and the Italian via the old tongue of Occitan, the Languedoc. Ezra Pound, now certainly he didn't discover it, but in it, just like it's inspired literary criticism, or it's just psychic discovery, or it's one's intangible practice of the art of poetry to discern these lineaments of beauty in ways that reflect on your own discovery of what forms constitute unique language, which Ezra Pound demonstrated in discovering all this old troubadour literature. But then, making, not just gestures of the hand and the tongue, but word into act and the foot upon the road, the acts of the apostles, right? There's the gospel message, but then there are the acts of the apostles. And both of them are necessary for the proper poetic understanding. And Ezra Pound walked upon the roads of old, the old country of the troubadours, and slept upon the stones of these ruins. And anyone on any level of metaphor who's ever explored old ruins understands that it is when the ruins understands eventually that it is the design of the ruins that is what constitute the timeless essence of the original structure, almost as if the structure as it was built and conceived in its time must give way to the inner design of its principle, which is discovered by the creative imagination, which is Ezra Pound lurking around in these ruins, And so no matter how much we can say truthfully that Ezra Pound went astray, almost you could say like Rambo went astray in terms of like the moral consecration of their gifts to the arc and the pattern of their lives. But that's what can happen if you take yourself too seriously. And Henry Miller is the vitamin against taking oneself too seriously. At the same time, he's the inspirer of what would otherwise be grandiosity, unless Miller had picked it up with his satirical seership and brought it to us in literary form. But at any rate, so Ezra Pound did these great things, these great and wonderful things. And you know, this too is a myth of the mental trajectory of certain types of mind. Ezra Pound, you know, you can, the diagnostic language, you know, just comes hot and heavy in Ezra Pound's later life when he is, you know, put on trial for treason and found not guilty by reason of insanity, and then spends, you know, 12 years, you know, in the mental hospital where he was visited by T.S. Eliot and E.E. Cummings and William Carlos Williams, his old college buddy, and T.S. Eliot came, and yes, Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot played tennis. And if you ever want to cure yourself of an obsession with modernist poets, just imagine that. And then you'll turn away and you'll want to go read something else or maybe watch TV. But no, that's exaggeration. But no. But who else came to visit him in St. Elizabeth? I'll tell you. We can talk about this, but maybe not name names. But all these rapscallion booksellers and these right-wing bookstores on the edges of Washington, D.C. and other places, and the cranks who, you know, World War II, right? We've mentioned, you know, the post-World War consensus, which we see breaking down then. Well, the roots of all that we see that is so destructive today is long nourished in a great variety of American verbal subcultures. And some real right-wing cranks came too and sat at the feet of Pound. Pound was so effortlessly charismatic, they would come in and he might say some provocative thing, and then he would write down some translation of Chinese poetry and tell them to put that in their bookstore. And they wouldn't know what he was talking about. They would, you know, because they were not selling that kind of book, you know. But you can imagine that, you know, Pound, maybe that's where his sense of humor came in. I don't know. But at the same time, the poets who came to Pound knew that, you know, as misled as he is, just like with Rambo, just as Henry Miller knows, just to hear him breathe, you can draw from it a certain kind of archetypal understanding of what makes a person tick, even though the watch is messed up, you know. It's just, that's just how it is. Sometimes the crack has to be there for the light to get through, you know, to use that, you know, labored metaphor. But at any rate, but there's a straight line, could you say? Well, okay, maybe you could. The line of obsession, and the obsession it turned into an obsession with money, with Pound, and everything that was related to that, because, see, something funny happened, and when, here's what happens. We have to talk about the god Hermes. Hermes is the god of messages. Hermes is Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes is a Renaissance tutelary spirit. Hermes is the psychopomp, the guide of souls. But Hermes is also the god of commerce. Hermes is also the god of exchange. Hermes is also the god of money. Hermes is the god of the crossroads. Hermes is the god of the half-truth. Hermes is the god of negotiations. Hermes is the god of the trickster and the con. Hermes is the god of money. Hermes gave us the alphabet. Hermes gave us the alphabet. Hermes brought it to mind of some tribal shaman saw the track of a bird in the riverbank mud and realized that the tracks of the bird were a language, though he didn't call it that, but he replicated those signs and the symbols, and it was easy for other people to assign meaning to that because it's a human capacity to make meaning out of, disparate things, and this was the birth of language, from the idea of Hermes to the idea of the humans. But well, what are coins but a specialized version of language? Paper money. What is paper money but surrealist art? The eye above the pyramid and all of this stuff. The severed heads, right? And the eagles with their shields and their arrows, as if they needed arrows with those talons, and, the bird of prey put upon the money. But that's a different god than Hermes, boys and girls. That's not Hermes' fault. Hermes gave people the idea to print money and say that, this means this and that and this, and I can have some of this and you can have some of that. And if I walk away with more of it, well, that's the nature of the momentum of existence in this life. Hermes kind of like facilitated that. But this notion of like this eagle warlord, this is a different kind of God. It's very much, it's an intimate power, in all of us that we can see and understand. But, at any rate, so there it goes astray, and for Ezra Pound, the obsession was a momentum. It was such a momentum, and it wasn't the nature of Ezra Pound to, humility couldn't help him there. We know that he fed stray cats, and we know that a great many people close to him, always thought very highly of him. But we also know that, things are more ambiguous there in the larger sense of things. But these lines of obsession became such that there was, you wish that one would look out for that. But one can only look out for that when one realizes that it's funny. Or if it's not funny, it's like gravy. Or if it's not like gravy, it's like understanding the place of suffering. If I can find it, I will tell you some homely wisdom of Henry Miller about this very thing. And it's in this one. And what he says to us, perhaps I will find it. But what he says to us is, it is understanding that, yes, what the 19th century people crucified themselves on, that very cross, is wood. But here's a tree. This is a living tree. And the wood to make that dilemma came from this tree. And the compulsion or the necessity that people end up there, stuck to it in such ghastly ways, is that too. That's not the fault of Hermes. That's, go back to the shield and the eagles and the talons. There is that. Which is predatory about enforcement of decrees. But there is also that which people willingly participate in so that they will feel significant to themselves because their obsessions have occluded their vision and their understanding. It can be like that. But at any rate, so what Miller talks about, and if I find the passage, I do, and if I don't, then I don't. But it's about the place of suffering. Maybe that's why it's so difficult to find in a book, the place of suffering, in the psyche's understanding, the place of suffering, in the place of opposition. Yes, what I was saying. What the 19th century people for Henry Miller archetypally crucified themselves on this dilemma. For Henry Miller, it was a lack of understanding that wood is drawn from, by the human hand, it is drawn from nature's actual, natural, real gift, the actual gift of life, of God, the tree of life, And yes, look into the branches of any remote tree, and you will see branches growing parallel. You will see branches radiating. You will see branches triangulating. You will see branches in star shape. And yes, you will see branches at cross purposes. You will even hear branches rub together and squeaking music when the wind blows. You will hear branches groan and twist as they move toward the light. You will hear all of that stuff. But it's the nature of the living tree. It is human beings who make crosses from trees. But trees themselves are, only God can make a tree. And somehow Henry Miller has the freshness and the life-givingness of this green insight. And he has it in such a way. This is when I speak of the sense of humor. Actually, that's what I'm talking about. And if only If only for Ezra Pound, can you imagine if you cannot shut off the din in your mind of, hot shovels digging into heaps of molten coins in the mint and the fires of the foundries, the golden and the melting and the furnaces and the workmen and the tedium. And that's the process of making money. Oh, but what a twisted form of alchemy that is. And can you imagine, the sound? Oh, Ezra Pound, in heaven, may you hear, the music of the troubadours more than you hear the clanging din of the metal mills of the machines of money. May it be that way for you. Henry Miller inspires us to say such a prayer for Ezra Pound and makes fun of him. So let's read a little bit of Money and How It Got That Way. A little bit of it that I have read. We will extract an idea from that, I believe. But my mind is still playing hide and seek with me now. But here it is. And it's insane. But here's what he writes. About a year ago, upon reading Tropic of Cancer, Ezra Pound wrote me a postcard. This is Henry Miller talking. Ezra Pound read Tropic of Cancer. Ezra Pound wrote me a postcard in his usual Kabbalistic style, because Ezra Pound, he had his own shorthand. That's part of his appeal and his ambiguity and his crankiness. But anyway, Ezra Pound wrote me a postcard in his usual Kabbalistic style, asking me if I had ever thought about money and what makes it and how it gets that way. The truth is that until Mr. Pound put the question to me, I had never really thought about the subject. Since then, however, I have thought about it night and day. The result of my meditations and lucubrations I now offer to the world in the shape of this little treatise, which, if it does not settle the problem once and for all, may at least unsettle it. I love how he calls it a treatise, because I know that Henry Miller, if he's going to write a treatise, it's only going to be to sharpen his sense of humor. He's going to twirl his mustaches, like an old-time vaudeville villain before he sets down his pen to write something like a treatise, because he's like Rabelais. Rabelais, he meant to make this fun. And he put his erudition and his crazed fluency and his utterly being beside himself with the fire in his head of poetry, he put it in the service of a good time, but a wholesome good time. And what's more wholesome than to grin at the devil when the devil is grinning at you, and know that, unlike the devil, you have a sense of humor. The devil is simply baring his teeth. Now, that's a short distance between that and desperate defiance. Be careful lest it throw us back into the 19th century, right? Anyway, so here's a little few sentences. But this gives you a taste of this satire, and this is historical stuff, actually. Oh, and for Ezra Pound, the metaphysical disturbance, the metaphysical restriction, which was so crazy-making, as they used to say, was this obsession with money. Well, as Henry Miller says, with money and how it gets that way. Well, for Ezra Pound, money was the way. Money was the way it was. And anyone who says different doesn't understand. It's like when Walt Whitman wrote about Jefferson Davis, saying Jefferson Davis is one who would not say, I don't prefer cabbages. He would say, I hate cabbages and damn anyone who loves them. He would put it that way. It's just this intense desire to gain energy for one's life, kind of from this notion of these kind of like animal conflicts. But it's hypnotic, of course. Anyway, so Henry Miller writes, with a great historical understanding and a twirl of his mustaches, in the days of Periclean Greece, money may be said to have occupied the same relation to economics as ballistics does to astrophysics today. The idea of money, dimly evolved during the late Minoan culture, was sharply clarified during the dialectical dissension which occurred with the first Socratic thrust at the primacy of the state. This all makes sense. It's hyperbolic only in the part about the first Socratic thrust at the primacy of the state. But I wouldn't say it's hyperbolic Well, yes, it is hyperbolic, but it's also like secondhand. You know, Socrates, he didn't thrust sabers. But it's okay to say that if you're making a point. Anyway, it is our intention in a short treatise of this scope to trace the biologico-economic aspects of the slave and master theory which underlay the then budding ideology of free finance, as it has come to be called. Professor Ernest McVeigh, in a monograph entitled The Rise of Currency, and maybe this actually exists, or maybe it's made up, has brilliantly depicted the nature of those oppositional forces which, about the time of Pericles, began to synthesize and form the elastic conception known as money. So, Pericles we usually associate with Thucydides and the address of Pericles. He was, a general statesman, and he made a certain series of utterances which communicate through a real throbbing and real form of human speech, certain kind of realities of the nature of the nascent state as it begins. And so it is only likely that Pericles would also have something to say about money. And so it's like Henry Miller is just maybe pointing his finger toward this notion that it's so primordial, our understanding of the nascent notions of the state and the nation, simultaneously, which is money kind of came to be a certain kind of thing which it wasn't necessarily before. But what is common to it has always been, we have to, give our understanding, back to our Hermetic kind of like pedagogy to say that what is similar and has always been, no matter all the changes in the nature of finance and stuff, is the notion of currency and change and flow, because then when we have that, then we can begin to understand waves and interrelationships. And we can also perhaps understand the water, or what is conveyed, which is, when Henry Miller looks at the word, it's the energy of meaning within the word. When we look at it from the standpoint of like a Hermetic notion of, transformative values in history, why we see the movement of the human faculty of valuing and of giving things value, and it is that. It does work. It is a poetic power. It is a fiat. It comes from darkness. It is like the fiat of, it is creative. It is on the creative altar. It is a sacrifice to a higher purpose, to give one's allegiance, or to give one's allegiance to these notions of value in order to connect one with the larger world. And necessity works that way, so hypnotically. And it is the nature of the poet to have it take place on an archetypal level, so that notions of currency as money and what people desire to see and be and identify with to the poet is something that somehow the poet is at a remove from that, and the drama is taking place in this other dimension. And he or she realizes that the self is being made on a whole other dimension than where I am. Am I, therefore, not a self? And if so, is that good? Or is it a limbo that is unpleasant? Or what is it really? Is it a hell? Is it a heaven? Is it a limbo? Some kind of transformation? Is a spiral turning? A universe? Una means one, verse means turning. You see, this is the archetypal notion of a certain kind of like, the poetic freedom of the awareness of the transmutation of values. And it takes a 19th century sufferer like Nietzsche to coin a phrase like the transvaluation, and it takes, Henry Miller kind of like opposing that creative burning flame with a kind of steady light of insight, to see it as something that is a human product, and there's something more primordial and yet more original underlying it than what these people are suffering in the grip of the drama of, And so it's just such a notion of the poet then as sage certainly transcends form, the written word. Even though its vehicle is the written word, we come to assemble it or alchemize it in ourselves into a living notion, which we can convey on speech through coming to it as mere words on the page. And so, Henry Miller would say, yes, guilty as charged. I seem to promulgate this notion of utter freedom and everything. And I understand some of my great masters, Lao Tzu, wrote just a tiny little fraction of all the, reams of dreck that I have written, says Henry Miller in The Imagination. Jesus never even wrote down a single word. Other people did that for him. And yet I have written all of these crazy autobiographical romances or these crazy screeds of me thinking out loud, oh, so how can I say that I am free if I am so addicted, to the word? Well, he says at a certain point in the same essay where he talks about the gift of understanding the place that suffering has as a transvaluer of values, as a crossroads on the road of value and flowing currencies, of all the mental energies that we are the crossroads of. To know that that this is something that is happening, in a dimension known only to one, is to realize then, oh, does that mean that all of these trials and these tribulations and these archetypal adventures and these gods and these heroes and these themes, such themes as liberation, such themes as self-renewal, such themes as death and rebirth, such themes as the function or the meaning or the purpose of the creative individual in our present civilization, that these are all nodes and swirls and crossroads upon, the flowing road of being that are available to language as something that I can express. Oh, then if I become addicted to it, well, then, in this sense, then that's good. Then that's because I like it. I like to write. Eventually, Miller he manages to say this. Now, he doesn't like the business of being famous and being a writer and everything, but he surrenders to it, and that's part of his bodhisattvahood, because he says, okay, I am no one, but I'll pretend not to be no one so that Walker will be able to talk about me long after I'm supposedly gone. It's like that kind of like game that's being played, But he surrenders to it in that sense. But at the same time, he realizes that no, the real meaning of it is that to be no one is free to see and understand these things in their actual original dimension, which is in one's self, which is simultaneously the realization of what is so life-giving, in the moral and ethical teachings of so many of the ancient religions, to the very notion of to ask one's own being, what does it mean, to give of oneself? Does it mean to find within oneself a worth of a value that is to be given? Is it simultaneously an understanding of the awareness that the nature of an artwork is that its meaning is as something given? It is something given. When we see beauty, we are given an awareness. And that awareness, as Henry Miller kind of transmutes it for us, helping us along, that awareness is simultaneously awareness of one's transparency, to the inner meanings of the cosmos. This is kind of the level at which Henry Miller is writing about. But then I could also talk about him a long time for, is obscenity, is a purveyor of obscenity and a farce, the obscenity and the farce and the mysticism, which I've spoken of, and obscurantism, yes, the obscurantism, which I've perhaps played with, but hopefully innocently. With Henry Miller, all these things are made available to us, you see. So, that being said, I want to do one more thing, but before I do that, I want to check my watch, and maybe if there's something here that needs more to be said, I can begin to approach, a kind of a proper and crystallized formation of that. Okay, one more thing about the notion of the poet, then, with Henry Miller, and that is we can illuminate our understanding of the ever giving of Plato, of the ever givingness of Plato. We can illuminate our understanding so as to receive more from the art writing of the great philosopher and poet Plato. when we understand a certain way that Henry Miller instinctively understands the art of rhetoric. Should I put it that way? Maybe I should say, when I say prose, right? I said prose poetry. I mentioned that. And so, we still don't know what that is really. We know it's something because Rambo worked good in it. And before him, a lot of those French, Aloysius Bertrand and Lautréamont, who was a bad boy, as well as Rimbaud, but they're all writing in prose. And but in English, in the formative works of English, especially Elizabethan English, in these rolling cadences, these flowery things, we start to ask ourselves, okay, well then, so what is this thing of rhetoric? And then when we get to the outer reaches of Henry Miller's hyperbole, when Henry Miller will say stuff like, it is not so much, the gesture or the speech or the words on the page, it is the life lived. And then we begin to see, well, first of all, that's Henry Miller kind of like opening up this notion, like the soul lives in intention, in these whole intentions and actions and values and momentums, which are not necessarily known to the conscious mind, much less the ego. The soul is like working in all these levels. So then how can the poem be restricted to this notion of a form on a page? As a matter of fact, or even a book on a shelf, because actually what makes books on the shelf possible in the public sphere, or poems on the page as published, is someone else's editorial judgment, which may or may not be inspired. It's the original artwork that is inspired, and the terms of that are worked out, in the artist's own inner soul. But there are so many brokers and so many boundaries crossed. And once again, Hermes has to say, but it's not my fault. It's not my fault. I am making it possible. Hermes would say, I am the one who is opening up the conduit so that these things can flow to you in representation after myriad representation. Money is the same way. The printed page is the same way. It's not my fault that things somehow can become corrupt. Though either way, says Hermes, I am Hermes doing what I do, And so you can't blame Hermes. If you do blame Hermes, then you end up being obsessed with money, say. But, that's we cannot accuse anyone of blaming Hermes. I mean, and even that's not hardly. We have a right to be angry at the gods. That's fair and good, and that's part of a true and real relationship. It behooves us to understand certain notions of decorum, but poetry can teach that. Poetry can be a safety guide for one, in that if one has a quarrel against God, or one can go for broke like Rambo and just live out your myth, and people will remember you. But Henry Miller says, but maybe you didn't have to suffer so much. I don't know. But that's just, be that as it may. So I want to read this one more thing, and then maybe we can kind of bring things around to some kind of notion. But no, it was one more thing about rhetoric. Yes, the poem then, just like the value of money transcends, the physical representation of money, the poem transcends the lines on the page, even prose, But, in the notion of utterance. See, to me, the poetry of poetry and the prose of prose is utterance. Because it is out of utterance, that is actually the gestural calligraphy, which we kind of can have access to in this world of time and space, which is so characteristic and so utterly of its own time and of its own immediacy. And that's part of the deadly peril of it, but that's part of the drama of it also. But Henry Miller writes with that spirit. And so, when we understand a poetic notion then of rhetoric, it opens up all the different things that we can work and all the ways that we can work as we conduct our daily lives as respecters of the poetic word and be actual poets of ourselves, I guess, in our daily calling. If we're doing things that we deeply feel like that we are led to do, there is that kind of that carrying on of a certain kind of intangible value. And so, so there is this notion, yes, okay, so it frees us then from this notion, of the calculative ego. Maybe we can put it this way, which so oppresses us. It is, long, at first, there were hermetic schools of scribes, their curriculum materials burned up in the flames of the Library of Alexandria, or maybe in other book burnings, in the periodic persecutions of heretics. They take these ancient and crazy symbolic forms, reams of written paper, and they're repelled by it and frightened by it because, they're reminded of a different way of understanding of these transmissions of value that they I don't know what you would call them, human beings, that take so much for granted in what they perceive as valuable from day to day, so much so that they will commit acts of violence, believing that they are defending it somehow or attacking something that is an enemy of that. And it is, reflected in the conflictual nature. There's the eagle clutching the arrows, of course, and the shield, and there's the language of the judicial system, which is gorgeous and beautiful language and comes from the same original primordial word roots of the human spirit coming to an understanding of shared expressions of otherwise invisible values, sometimes known only to consciousness by the vehicle of the word. That occurs in the literature of the law, as well as in the Holy Scriptures, and as well as subterraneanly, in the language and science of advertising, et cetera, et cetera. Practically every word is pregnant, with these reverberations, these unspoken reverberations that kind of work on the mind. One longs to be pure of the mind, and that's another thing that one has to go to the poets for, who have found as part of their poetic gift their own way to kind of come to terms and purify the language so that they can actually say what's really on their minds. It can be that way. So otherwise we're trapped in this notion, of literature and language and speech as being something like as a way to pragmatically make our way in the world, and things become chunks of argumentation, and they become chunks of analysis detached from the living awareness of the currency of life. And detached from that original value, they begin to take on a different kind of value, which isn't really value, but actually momentum. And yet it has a kind of magnetic quality where all these other associated values kind of gather and conglomerate it all around it. And then pretty soon it becomes a machine that gives thought, or seems to give thought. And only poetry in its conception as language's original nature is, there in society as the healing of that. And the way the medicine is sweet is because it's beautiful, let's say. Or the way the medicine is, attractive in some other ways because it's adventurous or provocative or challenging. I mean, there's room for all these kind of ways that you can hold human attention. But always, it's up to the poet to understand the deep the moral kind of restrictions that has, because human attention is like the tip of the soul. Where the soul touches the external world is in the human faculty of attention, which is something that seems to be realized in the present moment. Oh, but then again, there's masterpieces of literature which seem to hold the attention in a way transcendent of time. So, and Henry Miller speaks of things in this way. So it is like this, O poets. And here we are back again. I'm sure it's time for the peroration. Oh, the troubadours, and Ezra Pound did not know this, but I do, and I'm going to tell you. When the troubadours faced lean times, when they did not have the favor of the Lord at that moment, or when for one circumstance or another what was inspiring in the place where they were changed and they had to hit the road, and maybe sleep in the ruins, or maybe, go along the roads of Provence or the Languedoc, whenever they needed, shelter from the storm, there were the shepherds. And so many pastures are out there under starry nights where the shepherds are sitting there and they're making their beans, and the sheep are in the flock, and the shepherds are singing their songs to the sheep. It calms them down and they breathe in rhythm. And then they look over, and then sitting down there beside them is the troubadour from the local castle who's got no other place to go. And the troubadour says, hey, let's see if this will calm the flock. I sang this song and calmed the king. I will calm the flock here, shepherd, if you let me. We share an aspect of our art at its ancient source. After all, remember King David? King David, the psalmist, he was a shepherd also, and he sang a song to calm the king. And those melodies and chords still revert today secretly, and the words and the lyrics also do. Their hints are spread all around, in all the inspired writings. There's all of this that makes it so that, one who sees this vista, is given the understanding that, like, oh God, the hard, tangled knuckle knots of factual rhetoric, which so clog the finite creaturely mind, can sometimes be dissolved in the bath of life, in the bath of the original meaning of the word. And it happens all around us all the time in all these secret and not so secret ways. And sometimes it just takes, the turning of the key, a certain phrase or a certain persona or a certain aspect of things, or just some quality of attention where for one moment we lose ourselves and realize we are no one. And it happens in art, and literature is art. And I have endeavored this evening to speak of our master, Henry Miller, and those he speaks of in such a way as to, like, open up some of that commerce of the spirit, so that we can, revitalize ourselves, and in so doing be beneficial presences in the culture at large, which always has need of it. So I thank you for your heroic listening, and I will at this point say to you, thank you for your heroic listening, and I'm happy to divulge, what's on my mind, and I'm grateful that you hear it. Anyway, so long for now.